In this demo, I'll walk through installing the AzureRM PowerShell SDK for Windows and which commandlets we can use to configure a CDN endpoint for our demo blob storage. We'll verify our commands worked in the browser, and we'll also clean up the endpoint afterwards. Okay, we're going to start by installing the AzureRM PowerShell SDK. So on the Azure homepage, I'm going to click on this More link, and then go into Resources, and if I scroll down, I can click on this Downloads area here. This page lists all the SDKs and command line tools you can use for Azure, so we'll scroll down and find the command line tools section, and then go into the documentation for the PowerShell SDK. Once here, we can navigate to the Install section, and this explains how to get started with Azure PowerShell on Windows. You can also install it on Mac OS or Linux, install with an MSI, or even run it in a Docker container. You can follow either of those steps to install the SDK for your platform. Once you have the SDK installed, we can boot up a PowerShell session. Here I am inside of Visual Studio Code, and I have a PowerShell terminal open. So let's use our first commandlet, login-AzureRM account, to log in and view our subscriptions. This should go through the typical Azure login flow, and in my case, I'm logged in already. Next, we need to see how we can interact with Azure CDN. We'll start by using a git help command and typing a search expression *AzureRM CDN, which I know from reading the online documentation. We can see a list of all the available commandlets here, and notice they're part of the AzureRM.cdn module. Let's go ahead and import that module so we can use these commandlets. To enable Azure CDN with our storage account, we need to first create a CDN profile. We could use an existing one, but let's see how to make one from scratch. To do that, we'll use the new -AzureRM CDN profile commandlet. Let's open a little script here so we can see what parameters we can pass in. As you can see here on the left side of my screen, I've opened up a PowerShell file that includes all the commands that we need to run to create our profile and endpoint, and all the parameters we need to pass in. Let's go ahead and run the AzureRM CDN profile section first. And guess what? I ran into an error. It's actually because I'm on the wrong subscription, so we need to change that. Okay, now I've actually set it to my real subscription that has our Pluralsight resources. Let's rerun that command. Great, so we can even see in the provisioning state that it succeeded. So what I've just done is I've created a CDN profile. I've named it PS Azure Storage CDN. I've set its location to East US, and the SKU is standard Akamai. If you're curious, you can find the values for parameters like location and SKU using the typical PowerShell tab completion support. Our resource group name is from the portal. Now, to create an endpoint in this profile, we need to pass its name as well as the endpoint options. And you can see I'm taking my own advice and actively disabling HTTP support. I've also specified the blob service endpoint as the origin. So let's run that now. Fantastic, and again we can see the provisioning state succeeded. We should make doubly sure that both of these resources got created though. Let's use some other commandlets to actually list the resources. We can use the git-AzureRM CDN profile commandlet and the git-AzureRM CDN endpoint commandlet, and since this is PowerShell, I can pipe the output of profile to the input of my endpoint commandlet. And if we scroll up a little bit, we can see that we got the endpoint for the profile that we just created. Let's just execute the git-AzureRM CDN profile commandlet only now. And there we can see we have our new CDN profile. Perfect. Okay, now I've purposefully made us create an endpoint that won't work. How come? Well, we missed setting the origin host header property when we initially created the endpoint, as you can see here in the script output. We can fix this with the PowerShell SDK. To do so, first we need to grab the endpoint, then we set the new property value and pipe that to the set-AzureRM CDN endpoint commandlet. Let's run this snippet and see if it works. Great, it looks like it works because the origin host header is now filled in. It's time we open a browser and see whether or not our commands worked as we hoped. We named this endpoint PS Azure Storage CDN, so let's type that in plus the AzureEdge.net CDN suffix. Again, we need to make sure that we pass the static site /index.html since we're using the default configuration. And voila, it works! Now it's time to remove the resources we just made. Now, we should be good automation citizens and clean up after ourselves. To remove an endpoint, we can use the aptly named remove AzureRM CDN endpoint commandlet. To remove a profile, the remove AzureRM CDN profile commandlet does the job. Note that by using the profile commandlet, it will actually remove all the associated endpoints, and helpfully the SDK will prompt so you can confirm. Let's go ahead and remove the whole profile so we remove all the other resources. Alright, it looks like it succeeded. Let's make sure and execute that git-AzureRM CDN profile again, and yeah, no result, so it looks like it got removed completely. Perfect.